I want you to picture a family photograph on a mantelpiece. Not an old one, a recent one. Taken at Christmas 2 years after a remarriage, everyone dressed in the same warm tones, arranged in front of a tree. The father, the stepmother, her 2 children from her first marriage, and a space where someone used to be. Not a physical space. The photograph is full. There is no gap in the arrangement, no empty chair, no visible absence. That is precisely the point. The space I am describing is the space that used to be occupied by the father's daughter from his first marriage, who is not in the photograph because she was not invited to the Christmas where it was taken, and whose absence has been arranged so seamlessly that anyone looking at that mantelpiece would have no reason to know she had ever existed. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I saw that photograph. What matters is what my father said when I asked him why I wasn't in it. And what matters most of all is what I found out 3 years later, sitting across from my father's estate attorney, about exactly how thoroughly I had been erased and what I intended to do about it. Stick around. This one is about more than a photograph. Welcome back to Blood and Backbone, where we talk about the moments families don't put in the holiday newsletter. If you're new here, these stories are dramatized for entertainment, but the particular grief of being erased from a parent's life by a step-parent, that part requires no dramatization. If it's real for you too, you're in the right place. Let's get into it. Let's call her Margot. 36 years old, a landscape architect, the only child of her father's first marriage, which ended when Margot was 8 years old, in the particular way of marriages that end not with a single dramatic event but with a long, slow, mutual exhaustion that nobody involved has the energy to name until it is already over. Her mother raised her. Her father was present in the way that some fathers after divorce are present, regularly at first, then less regularly, then in a pattern that could be charitably described as doing his best and uncharitably described as gradually replacing one family with a newer and more convenient arrangement. His name was Robert. He was not a bad man in any grand sense. He was a weak one in the specific sense that matters in these stories, which is that he consistently chose the path of least resistance when the path of least resistance conflicted with the path of doing right by his daughter. The stepmother's name was Lynette. She arrived in Margot's life when Margot was 14, which is a particularly difficult age at which to acquire a stepmother, and she arrived with 2 children of her own, a son and a daughter, aged 12 and 10, who were by all accounts perfectly ordinary children and who were not responsible for what their mother did but who benefited from it in ways that will become relevant. Lynette was not overtly cruel to Margot. She never said anything that could be quoted back as evidence of bad intent. What she did instead was something more sophisticated and therefore more damaging. She created, steadily and over years, an environment in which Margot was made to feel like a visitor in her father's home rather than a member of it. It was in the way the house was decorated after the wedding, with photographs of Lynette's children everywhere and no photographs of Margot. It was in the way family plans were made, vacations, holiday traditions, weekend activities, that assumed a household of 4 and added Margot as an afterthought when she was there rather than building around her as a 5th member. It was in the way Lynette spoke to Robert about Margot when she thought Margot couldn't hear, not with hostility, with the particular dismissive affection of someone discussing a complicated obligation, your daughter, rather than Margot, or her name. Margot spent 4 years navigating this before she left for college and discovered, with considerable relief, that her own life was very easy to build and maintain in the complete absence of her father's household. She built it. She finished her degree, started her career, made friends, traveled, found a sense of herself that had nothing to do with the family she had been a visitor in and everything to do with the one she was constructing deliberately out of her own choices. She maintained a minimal relationship with her father, calling on birthdays, visiting once a year at a time carefully chosen to minimize overlap with Lynette's family, accepting the version of her father that was available to her, which was the version that existed when Lynette was not in the room, warmer and more like the father she remembered from before the divorce, and filing away the knowledge that this version was not the version in charge of anything that mattered. The Christmas photograph was something she saw by accident. She had stopped by her father's house unexpectedly, a rare occurrence, to drop off a birthday gift for him on her way through town, and Lynette answered the door and let her in with the particular expression of someone performing warmth for an audience that might be watching. Margot waited in the living room while her father was called from another part of the house, and in waiting she looked at the mantelpiece and found the Christmas photograph and stood in front of it for a long time counting the people in it. Her father, Lynette, Lynette's son and his wife, Lynette's daughter and her boyfriend. 7 people in matching warm tones in front of a Christmas tree that Margot recognized as her father's, in the living room she was standing in, taken at a Christmas she had not been invited to. She was not in it. She had not been invited to the Christmas at which it was taken. She had received, that year, a card from her father with a $50 gift card inside it and a message in his handwriting that said, "Thinking of you this holiday season. Love, Dad," which she had understood at the time as a communication of distance and now understood as something more specifically chosen. Her father came into the living room and she pointed at the photograph and asked, as levelly as she could manage, why she wasn't in it. His answer, which she has described as the most honest thing he said to her in 20 years because it was honest about his own failure rather than designed to manage her feelings, was that Lynette had organized the Christmas gathering and he had not thought to insist on Margot being included. He had not thought to insist. 22 years of being her father and he had not thought to insist. Margot took her birthday gift back. Not dramatically, not angrily, just quietly picked it up from the table where she had set it and took it with her when she left. She drove home and sat in her car in her own driveway and made a decision she had probably been building toward for 22 years but had never let herself make completely because she had never stopped hoping the next version of events would be different. She decided she was done hoping. Not done with her father entirely, she was not capable of that and did not want to be, but done extending the relationship more generosity than it was actually generating in return, done treating her father as a better father than he was behaving as, done managing her own grief about the situation with the specific patience of someone who keeps believing the situation is temporary. It was not temporary. It had been the situation for 22 years. She started treating it accordingly. She called less often. She declined invitations to events at her father's house with polite brevity and no detailed explanation. She stopped going out of her way to schedule the careful visits and let the relationship settle into whatever it was naturally without her engineering. What it settled into, without her engineering, was very little. Her father called occasionally, the calls shorter and less substantial than they had once been, Lynette's influence visible in every call in the form of a faint background quality of managed conversation, as though the call itself was being monitored for content. Margot answered these calls and was polite and gave nothing away, which she had learned to do very well over 22 years of practice. Then her father got sick. Not immediately fatal, not a sudden event, but a diagnosis serious enough that the word estate entered family conversation within a few months of the initial news. Margot found out about the diagnosis from her mother, who had remained on cordial terms with Robert for Margot's sake over the decades and who heard it through a mutual acquaintance. Robert himself did not call Margot to tell her directly, which she noted with the same careful, patient noting she applied to everything in this family. She reached out to him. She was present through the early treatment months, not as fully as she might have been had the relationship been different but present, calling regularly, offering to help where help was accepted, behaving as a daughter in the ways available to her. She met with the estate attorney 6 months after the diagnosis at her father's request, the first time she had ever been formally included in any family financial conversation. She arrived prepared for a range of possible outcomes, because she was someone who had been managing her expectations about this family for 22 years and had learned to prepare for what was actually likely rather than what would be fair. What she found when the documents were reviewed was worse than her most realistic expectation. The estate had been restructured 18 months earlier, shortly after the Christmas photograph had been taken and roughly a year before the diagnosis. The restructuring, done cleanly and legally by competent attorneys, had effectively directed the significant majority of Robert's assets into structures that benefited Lynette and her children either directly or upon his death. Margot was included in the will, technically, with a bequest that represented a small fraction of the estate's total value and was framed in the document with the specific language of someone who had been included minimally to avoid a legal challenge rather than meaningfully to be genuinely provided for. She read it twice. She thought about the Christmas photograph. She thought about thinking of you this holiday season. She thought about he had not thought to insist. She asked the estate attorney several very specific questions about the restructuring timeline, the instruments used, the degree of Robert's independent decision-making during the process, and whether any aspects of the arrangement raised questions about undue influence, which is a legal concept she had looked up the night before the meeting because she was someone who prepared. The attorney, a careful man named Henderson who had clearly not anticipated this line of questioning and who was now recalibrating his assessment of the woman sitting across from him, answered each question precisely and noted that certain aspects of the timeline might warrant further review. Margot retained her own attorney the following week. She was not interested in destroying what her father had built. She was not interested in a public fight that would exhaust everyone in it and produce a fraction of what it cost. What she was interested in was two things specifically. First, an honest conversation with her father about what had happened and why, conducted while he was still alive and well enough to have it, because she had watched the Christmas photograph moment teach her that she had spent years hoping for honesty that never arrived unbidden, and she was no longer willing to wait for it. Second, a legal review of the restructuring that established clearly whether the instruments used could withstand scrutiny, not because she intended to litigate necessarily, but because she intended Lynette to know they were being scrutinized, which was a different and in some ways more precisely targeted thing. She had the conversation with her father on a Tuesday afternoon in his living room, with the Christmas photograph still on the mantelpiece behind him, which she found appropriate. She said what she had said the day of the photograph, only more completely and with 22 years more of specifics. She said it without anger and without tears because she had processed most of the anger and tears years ago, and what was left was something cleaner. A clear accounting delivered by someone who has been keeping the books accurately for a very long time and is finally showing someone else the ledger. Robert cried. Genuinely, and for a long time, the crying of someone who has been handed an accurate mirror by a person they have failed and cannot dispute the accuracy of what they are seeing. He said he was sorry in a way that was real and also insufficient, and also the most he had ever said to her directly about any of it. He could not undo the estate restructuring unilaterally. The instruments were not designed to be easily reversed, but he contacted Henderson and instructed him to review whether adjustments could be made that reflected more accurately what he described, for the first time in Margot's memory, as his actual intentions regarding his daughter. Henderson made adjustments. Not complete ones. The structures Lynette's interests were built into were not entirely dismantleable without her agreement, which was not forthcoming, but meaningful ones. The bequest was revised upward. A specific property, a small piece of land her father had bought early in his career and that had sentimental value to Margot specifically because he had taken her there as a child, was removed from the general estate and titled directly to her. Lynette was not pleased. Lynette's displeasure was communicated through channels, through her children, through Henderson, through the specific temperature of the room when Margot visited her father in the months that followed, but was not communicated directly to Margot because Lynette and Margot had never had a direct conversation about any of this and were not about to begin now. Robert died 14 months after the diagnosis. The estate settled in the manner the revised document specified. Margot received what she was left, which was more than she would have received without the conversation and less than she would have received had the restructuring not happened, but more than enough, she has said since, to feel like she was acknowledged rather than managed. The Christmas photograph came down from the mantelpiece during the estate process, one of a number of items catalogued and distributed. Margot did not ask for it. She has a different photograph of her father, an older one, from before the remarriage, taken on a hiking trip when she was 6 years old, and he is looking at her the way he looked at her before he learned not to insist. She kept that one. It lives on her own mantelpiece now, in a house that is entirely hers, where every photograph on every surface is there because she chose it. Here's what I keep coming back to with this one. Margot did not fight for money. She fought for acknowledgement, for an honest conversation, for the record to reflect something closer to the truth before it was too late to have that conversation at all. The estate adjustments were a consequence of the honesty, not the goal of it. And the photograph she kept was not the one with 7 people in matching warm tones. It was the one where her father was looking at her the way fathers are supposed to look at their children, before the path of least resistance became the only path he knew how to take. Sometimes what you are owed is not money. Sometimes it is just the truth, spoken plainly, before the person who owes it to you runs out of time to say it. If this story hit close to home for you, Drop a comment and tell me what you would have asked for in that conversation. And if you want more stories like this one, I've got a new one coming this week. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and I'll see you in the next story.